Thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. I am from Sydney. It's fantastic to be down here in Hobart. I want to just start off first by explaining where I've come from and to attempt to give you an idea of the magnitude of the project that I'm working on. And I'm afraid that this one little PowerPoint slide wouldn't quite do that justice, so I've got a very short video that I want to run.
Of a new era, Sydney Metro. Australia's biggest public transport project is rapidly taking shape. In the city's booming northwest, Stage 1 opens in 2019. The tunnels are finished. More than 35 kilometres of track is down. And now the SkyTrain and our new landmark railway bridge are complete. Australia's first fully automated metro train has arrived for testing and commissioning. A train every 4 minutes in each direction when services start, with a future ultimate capacity of every 2 minutes under the CBD. Mega tunnel borers will soon be back in Sydney as we get ready to start tunnelling again from Chatswood to Sydenham. This time, there'll be 5, including a specialised tunnel boring machine under Sydney Harbour as new metro rail is extended from the northwest into the Sydney CBD and beyond to Bankstown by 2024. We've awarded a $2.81 billion tunnelling contract. Major city construction activity has started, and the first tunnel boring machine will be in the ground before the end of next year. Above the stations, planning has started to integrate them into communities and places. New, fast and frequent metro rail will transform Sydney, making the city more livable and connected, more productive and more attractive globally. At Victoria Cross in North Sydney and at Pitt Street, there'll be new commercial, residential and retail opportunities. To the southwest, we've started the planning process to upgrade the Bankstown line to metro rail standards, including level access between the train and the platform, new lifts and entrances, and Australian first platform screen doors. And now, Sydney Metro West, a new world-class railway which will grow with Western Sydney for generations to come. Connecting communities between the Sydney CBD and Parramatta, new metro rail will become the fastest, easiest and most reliable journey between these two great places. Consultation has started to determine the route alignment and stations along the way, taking the pressure off Sydney's public transport network. Welcome to Sydney Metro, the biggest urban rail infrastructure investment in Australian history.
So it's a pretty big project. So I manage the Occupational Health and Hygiene program for Sydney Metro, and I like to use this picture to explain what occupational health and hygiene is. So I want you to think for a moment how much energy, effort, systems, resources and money we spend every day to prevent fatality due to injury at work. And this one worker represents the approximate 250 Australians that unfortunately lose their lives each year in this country due to an injury at work. This is how many Australians, by comparison, lose their lives from an occupational illness and disease every year. It's around 2,000 Australian workers. And in the context of construction, a lot of those fatalities are due to respiratory illnesses. So they've been exposed to something at work which has then caused a chronic illness or disease that has taken their life. Occupational health and hygiene is all about the health in the health and safety. And now think about yourselves, to yourself, how much energy and effort in your own companies do you spend on preventing illness and disease? Hopefully it's this much by comparison. So some key health hazards that we deal with on the Sydney Metro range from respirable crystalline silica, noise, diesel exhaust, UV radiation, thermal heat stress and psychosocial hazards, things that are fairly common in the construction industry. But I want to put one specific one into context for you. We plan to tunnel further in the next 7 years in Australia than we have in more than the past 2 decades. Around 2/3 of all of that tunnel construction will occur in Sydney, and all tunnelling in Sydney encounters shale and a rock known as Hawkesbury sandstone. Sandstone and a portion of shale mainly consists of quartz, and tunnelling through quartz-containing rock generates a carcinogenic dust known as respirable crystalline silica. Overexposure to silica dust is known to cause an incurable lung disease called silicosis, in addition to lung cancer and other diseases. And shockingly, the risk of developing silicosis from exposure to the current legal limit or the workplace exposure standard has been quantitatively estimated to be anywhere from 12 to as high as 77% of workers over their working life. It's a shocking statistic. Even more shocking is that unfortunately, silica dust becomes even more toxic when it's freshly fractured, as in the case of tunnel construction. So in our case, it's probably higher, towards that 77% number. And during tunnelling, crystalline silica exposures can be well in advance more than 20 times the current workplace exposure standard. The common last line of defence applied to protect the health of tunnel and construction workers in general in this country, well, it's the P2 dust mask, my favourite. But silica dust exposure doesn't just occur in tunnelling, even though it's incredibly common. It also occurs through saw cutting, masonry, rock, tiles, for example, kitchen bench tops. From sweeping, so think of the traffic controllers at the front of a construction site, and every time they sweep the front without putting water there first, that's a silica exposure risk. Drilling into bricks or masonry, shotcreting is very high silica exposures. Any type of jackhammering or pile breakback for those on major projects, and simple things like an excavator moving a particular piece of material, especially if it's got sandstone or any type of quartz-containing substance, backfilling and just general shoveling. In general, respirable crystalline silica exposures are what we'd call ubiquitous or everywhere in the Australian construction industry, but just because it's everywhere, it doesn't mean that it's acceptable. To give you an idea of the scale of what we're up against in tunnelling, we normally only have 1 or 2 major tunnelling projects occurring in Australia at any one time. At this point, we have about 5. We're about to have 7. So we have a huge, massive influx of new workers that will come to support these major infrastructure projects. So we have an opportune time to not only look backwards to our past to see what we can learn, but look outwards internationally to see what we can do better to help particularly control this high risk in this industry. In 2016, I applied and I was successful in obtaining a Winston Churchill Fellowship from the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust with my project entitled Investigating Best Practice to Prevent Illness and Disease in Tunnel Construction Workers. The Churchill Trust was set up in 1965 to honour the memory of the late Sir Winston Churchill, and it provides funding or a pathway to go and seek international best practice leaders in their field and bring that knowledge back for the benefit of Australian society. So for 2 months last year, the fellowship funded my travel to the major tunnel areas of the world, the UK, Switzerland, Norway and the USA, where I visited major conferences, major tunnelling projects, research institutions and industry associations in my quest to answer this question, because I wanted to bring it back in time so that we could implement those learnings in our industry now so we wouldn't have to relearn the lessons of our past. And I want to share some of the results of that fellowship with you, and I'll mainly focus on the importance of engagement and collaboration, but to be honest, it all has to fit together in one big system for it to be effective. So before I left on this fellowship, I spent a lot of time researching existing best practice health and safety frameworks to make sense of all the information that I would get. And the little graphic on that side sort of explains what all those elements were. The first, probably not surprisingly, was how important leadership was in preventing ill health at the coal face or the tunnel face per se. If you have a CEO, if you have a site supervisor, a project manager, asking people on that site, what are you doing to control silica dust exposure? All of a sudden, that person takes it very seriously, particularly if it's a CEO of a major Tier 1 construction company, for example. Leadership at that level has been demonstrated, particularly in the UK, to drive positive change all the way down through the supply chain. Another element was health in design. Internationally, for example, Norway and Switzerland are fantastic at designing for the actual construction period. What can we do at this point to prevent exposures while workers are constructing this particular piece of infrastructure? Engagement and collaboration I'll talk to the next few slides, so I'll skip it. Other elements were things like standards. So in countries that don't have great legal standards for health and safety, and we have some great ones, but in some cases they're not sufficient to prevent illness and disease. You just heard me talk about 77% of workers can develop silicosis at the current legal limit. Sometimes we have to go that little bit further. And I found that internationally, where legislation wasn't overly prescriptive or it was a bit grey, then Tier 1 organisations or even the client had put together prescriptive standards to further drive that bar even higher across their projects, and that was found to be very effective. I looked at targeted management, which for example would be something that you'd put in place to reduce a specific exposure. Probably the easiest example to use would be using water on a concrete saw. So every time you use a concrete saw, you have to have water in place. That's a targeted management piece, as opposed to program management, which is the process by which every time you pick up that saw, you have to use water. So you go to different projects and you ask people what their best practice control measures are, and they can list 50 of them, but do they use them each and every time that particular task is done? That's what I looked at program management. I saw some great training and awareness campaigns internationally, and we've got some great ideas about how to do or implement them at Sydney Metro as a result of that. And lastly, the most important element that I saw was sustainability. Construction is temporary. Our projects might last 2 years, they might last 5. So what sustainable practices do we have as an industry to move those lessons through the entire industry and not just let them, I guess, fizzle away when that project is finished? So that's a very short snapshot of the 300-page fellowship, which you're more than willing to download and read in your spare time. So probably one of the most important elements, engagement and collaboration. This is a snapshot of what I found. In the UK particularly, I saw that collaboration across multiple projects resulted in sharing of knowledge earlier, so that good practices were adopted earlier than they may have been otherwise. They talked, they shared, they were really open and honest about what worked and what didn't work. I found that independent industry groups, and this may be a great example of such, both raised awareness and drove a best practice approach. A good example would be the Breathe Freely campaign, which is run by the British Occupational Hygiene Society, the BOHS. They have a fantastic campaign called Breathe Freely, which you can download easily accessible guidance, notes and tools to help you manage silica exposure, and they're directly relevant to us in Australia as well. And I found that engagement with research partners enabled a greater understanding of the magnitude of the issues, leading to better control measures being implemented. Loughborough University have a partnership with Thames Tideway, a very large tunnelling project in the UK, where researchers are embedded in that project and they look at how effective different health and safety initiatives are. We have a similar approach at Sydney Metro, where we have RMIT researchers embedded in our projects, and they're researching different initiatives that we're working on also. But you might ask, how is this relevant? Well, I think it's incredibly relevant, because health risks are common across all of our projects, so we're really in this together. I don't know if you're aware, if you don't work in construction, but generally different construction contractors and projects don't sit around the table holding hands singing Kumbaya. They don't always get along. It can be very competitive, and sharing knowledge generally doesn't happen very freely. And the whole us versus them mentality isn't overly productive, because they may have really good ideas that we haven't considered. And if we keep going down the same path that we've always done, we may be completely missing something that someone else is working on. So collaboration is definitely key. At Sydney Metro, we're lucky. We have 6 guiding values that define how we work. The first being safety and wellbeing, and health is included in that. But the second is collaboration. And that's really, for us, we're taught it's all about having positive relationships in a collaborative space. So you have clients and contractors and supply chains working together, getting rid of competition, but working collaboratively. And it's worked really well, and I'll explain that in the next couple of slides. But it asks you to think about the core values that you have as a company, And if you don't have collaboration, I recommend you maybe consider it in your next review, because it's really handy, particularly when you're having some heated discussions, and you can remind people back to those core values and are we being collaborative in this discussion. I found it to be very worthwhile. So some collaborative things that we've worked on since I've been back. Last year, Sydney Metro and Safe Work New South Wales signed a collaboration protocol, Safe Work New South Wales being our health and safety regulator. And that really just formalised our relationship of working together. It doesn't strip Safe Work New South Wales of any of their regulatory powers that they'd be more than willing to use, of course. But what it does do is talk about or list out things that we will definitely work together with and how we'll support each other to achieve our objectives. One of those is the hazardous chemicals and materials exposures baseline reduction strategy, in which we've been supporting Safe Work New South Wales with their top 2 hazardous chemicals of focus. The first being formaldehyde, not overly relevant to the works that we're doing. The second is respirable crystalline silica. So in that capacity at Sydney Metro, we have a wealth of industry experience. And so we've been sharing that experience with Safe Work New South Wales inspectors. They've put on maybe just under 24 new inspectors to support the infrastructure work that's happening in Sydney. And so we've been creating training packages and generally just an open voice on the other end of the phone to provide information on how the Tier 1 construction industry typically manages silica exposures, some common misconceptions, some things that are working really well. As you would appreciate, there's not that many people that have worked in underground tunnelling construction before, so it wouldn't be rare to anticipate that some of those inspectors have not been underground. And how effective are they going to be if they're not equipped with the right information to help them make the right decisions, for example? But that's the regulator, and it's important to have a strong regulator, a strong client and a strong contractor to make positive change. But it's more than just one project. So late last year, we approached the Australasian Tunnelling Society, which is a sub-group of Engineers Australia, and we gained approval to hold our very industry's first silica in tunnelling workshop. We had the regulator, Safe Work New South Wales, we had clients of all the tunnelling projects in our state, and we had contractors working across all the tunnelling projects in that state. So if you're not familiar with it, in New South Wales, we have Sydney Metro, WestConnex M4 East, WestConnex New M5, and NorthConnex as our 4 main tunnelling projects at the moment, soon to be more. And at that workshop, Safe Work New South Wales presented their silica strategy of what they wanted to achieve, i.e. reduced exposures and how they wanted to get there. And they had a consultative approach in getting feedback from people at that workshop. But we all know that not much really happens in a 2 to 3 hour workshop. You don't actually create anything, you just talk about stuff. So we created our industry's first air quality working group. We meet every 2 months and we progress initiatives pertaining to silica dust exposure, both control and raising awareness. But I wanted to share with you, I guess, some of the powerful impacts of or results of collaboration, and particularly in the context of that workshop, maybe to provide some inspiration. First of all, at that silica and tunnelling workshop, we asked participants a really powerful question. And I will say that the participants there weren't necessarily health and safety professionals. They're tunnel directors, construction directors, for example, the people that are actually responsible for delivering these tunnels. So they have quite a lot of things to think about, in addition to silica, may not be number 1 on their list. But we asked everyone, how important is it that we address the issue of silicosis in tunnelling? And we had like a silent voting scheme. 1, the issue doesn't need to be addressed, all the way to 5, which was, this is the most important issue, critical to the longevity of our industry. And I really crossed my fingers with what they said, and this was the outcome, which was great. And this really demonstrated to me that, yeah, we can work collaboratively on this issue, even though we may be from different contract organisations or different backgrounds. Yes, this is an important issue that we can work on. But then we asked everybody why it's important, and the results were a bit heartfelt. Things from, you know, a healthy workforce is critical for any business, through to every worker has the right to work in a safe environment, all the way through to because silica kills workers. Now, you may not know, but at least in our state, in New South Wales, silicosis is not a reportable disease. So if workers do have silicosis, the only way we would have that statistic would be if they claimed workers' compensation. which is not common in our industry. We have no centralised health surveillance scheme in construction or tunnel construction, so any contractor can use any medical provider they choose. Does not have to be an occupational physician, does not have to be a respiratory specialist. So our statistics around how many workers in Australia have silicosis are a little bit skewed. It doesn't show that there's very many. However, working in construction for 20 years and working in maybe 8 major tunnelling projects, I can tell you that it's very, very common to work alongside a silicotic worker. And definitely for the people in that room who had far more experience than I had and had been working in tunnelling for probably more than I've been alive, have actually witnessed that activity occurring. The next thing we asked was, how important is it that we work in collaboration with the regulator to address the issue of silica dust control? And to provide some context, it has historically been very rare for our health and safety regulator to go underground. It's been common for the regulator to come to a project, but it's not common for the regulator to go underground, and if they were to go underground, it wouldn't be common for that particular inspector to have a background in silica dust control. This is even more difficult because you can't see silica dust, it's so fine, so underground you can't see anything, so you wouldn't know just by looking at it if it was there or not. You'd have to get, there's quite a process to determine it. So with that in mind, we asked participants this question, again, 1 to 5 scale, 1 not important, 5 most important issue, and this is how everyone voted. And I found this a really, really powerful message. But then we asked people why it's important that we collaborate with the regulator, and we haven't really done it before, so why should we? And these were the responses. Because it's an industry-wide problem that needs assistance to achieve its goals, so that the eventual standards are well-informed and achievable. And this is alluding to the fact that potentially there should be a code of practice or updated guidance material on how to deal with this issue in tunnelling. They want to consult and achieve best practice. A regulatory influence is necessary to embed occupational health and hygiene in the design and concept phase. As individuals, we cannot solve this issue. It needs to be a collective effort. It's critical for the regulator to understand the challenges, to develop industry best practice and compliance material. We need a balance of regulation and self-management, and industry holds the bulk of the knowledge and experience. It's definitely true. And we've been looking after this for 30 years, and it's good to see the drive for us to work together, finally. Consultation leading to the practicality of compliance means less chance of failure, and this is too an important issue, not to. So that really set the scene for what the Air Quality Working Group has been working on, because as you would appreciate, the only way to prevent or significantly reduce illness and disease in a high-risk cohort like tunnel or construction workers is to make sure that we take a holistic approach and focus on all exposures that construction workers experience. It's no good to have one project that's exceptional at health and safety when a tunnel worker will leave that project and go to another one and be highly exposed. The only way that we're going to protect the health of tunnel workers is through collaboration, engagement, and ultimately working together to achieve best practice. So hopefully I've shared some information that you found really valuable, and thank you very much. Any questions? Yes.
Yes. So just to help measure exposure of silica dust, what was the extent of Metro Sydney as far as air monitoring?
Sorry, say again?
Air monitoring?
Yes.
Yep.
How do we do it?
Yep.
Okay, so the way to measure silica dust in air is through personal monitoring. So occupational hygienists come out, they put a pump on and fit a cyclone to a worker. In tunnelling, it's pretty well done. So you'll have monitoring happening every week or 2 weeks over 10 to 15 workers, and they're grouped into different work groups, and then the results are compared. I think the shocking thing, though, is that if you're not familiar with that industry and maybe you've been looking at a task for a really long time and you've never measured it, you get used to things and you think things are okay, and it's not until you measure it and you see the results that you realise that, wow, exposure is really high. I talked at the beginning of the presentation about silica exposures being over 20 times the exposure standard. That's publicly available information that was measured by Work Health and Safety Queensland during their intervention studies in 2009. At this stage, there's limited publicly available information on the extent of silica dust exposure in tunnelling. However, I could say that that figure is fairly accurate. Yeah.
What are some of the practical processes that you put in place to actually reduce?
Oh, that's a really good question. Dust suppression at the source is really vital. So, for example, if you have an excavator with a hammer doing hammering, then rather than having a worker with a garden hose, which is completely useless, to be honest, and just exposes that worker to high levels of silica dust, to fit solenoids and dust suppression directly to the hammer itself, or get workers out of the way entirely. Enclosed cabins with pressurised ventilation systems through sort of HEPA filters. We find that a lot of our exposures are through areas that are not a bit more easier to control. They're not right at the tunnelling face. And a really good example would be replacing fabric seats in excavator cabins with leather seats, or using plastic covers over an excavator cabin and using a HEPA vacuum or wet methods to clean it out, rather than a brush and broom in which you're exposing yourself to silica dust that's been dried out from your boots from getting in and out of the cabin. Yes?
How close are you to developing the carbon capture?
So at this point, we've been consulting with all the major tunnelling projects to agree on what would be the minimum control measures expected for certain high-risk tasks. So I've kept this presentation quite high level, but generally there's two tunnelling methods, TBM or tunnel boring machine tunnel that you saw in the video from Sydney Metro, which has relatively lower exposures to road header tunnelling or mined tunnels. They have very high exposures. They're different types of tunnelling mechanisms, so not one control measure will fit everything, so it has to be fit for that particular task. So the idea at this point is to outline what those high-risk tasks are across the different projects, which is done. The projects then nominate what their minimum and best practice controls are for each one of those tasks, which is complete. And Safe Work New South Wales inspectors go out to each one of those tunnel projects, and they look at the efficiency of those control measures to control exposures to silica, and that's currently in process. So about a year.